Thank you very much. I am Karen Armstrong from the More Strategic Group. And on the screen now, in a second, I think you'll be able to see the team and you'll be able to see Gavin with us too. So this is the More Strategic Group. We're a pretty, well, I think we're a pretty fabulous crew. So we're going to get together over the next 6 weeks and organise some webinars. What's amazing about all this team is that everyone comes with their own strengths and areas of interest. And we're constantly trying to look at how we can pull together practices across a whole number of sectors and think about how we apply those to the charitable sector. So I'm really looking forward to connecting with everybody across the sector over the next 6 weeks. We actually have created More Minds because we have been working with charities for many, many years now. And as we work with designing their strategies, we realise that there's a real need to make sure that we support charities in taking strategies into action. So the whole intent of More Minds is that you'll be able to either join as an individual or as an organisation and be able to participate in an ongoing annual program that helps to keep everyone I guess, united and accountable and moving forward into delivering particular outcomes. So very excited to have that, and even more excited to actually have our first webinar of the series with Gavin Coopy, who is appropriately designed in his NHS t-shirt just to get us going. So look, I can't speak highly enough of Gavin. As I mentioned, we like to bring a lot of disparate ideas together and really create clarity from them, and Gavin is exceptional at that. So I've already had a little bit of a sneak preview, and I know that he's got some amazing content to go through with us today, which is going to be really fantastic. So I actually first met Gavin 14 years ago when actually he was the director of brand innovation at Cancer Research UK. That is the largest charity in the UK, so pretty exceptional experience, and then set up with Martin Paul More Strategic, which has been going for over 10 years now. So Gavin is a social researcher of consumer and donor insights to inform brand, proposition and innovation, really working with senior leadership across NFPs to deliver social change. But as I said to Gavin beforehand, this really undersells him because he's got just exceptional skills in so many places, and really does help to bring back all of that kind of strategic thinking, always pull us out of the tactical and day-to-day. So I'm going to hand it across to Gavin now, who is going to take us through the crystal ball of what COVID holds for all of us. So thanks very much for joining.
Thanks very much for that intro, Karen. And it's great to be involved with the More Minds project, because it's about sharing the information that we all have, which is great across that team, both in Australia and in the UK, where Julie Roberts represents us there, and some of you may have met her if you're in the UK. So today, looking at my crystal ball, really we're looking at the big themes of where have we got to and where are we going with COVID-19 and the ongoing impact. What have been the impacts on life, fundraising and the universe, so to speak? And what do we do now? What are the principles we should be carrying forward into the future and protecting your base, building back better? And COVID-19 has been a common experience for a lot of us across the Western world. And I like to call it the moment when first world problems became real. And where are we at? I like this quote from Winston Churchill. Now, this is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning. Interestingly, he said that in November 1942. So there was still nearly 3 years of war to go, and today is VE Day, Victory in Europe Day. So that was another 3 years. Are we in for another 3 years of this? Maybe, maybe not. But I think if we look at it in percentage terms, which is always a good way to look at it, then that's 56% of the way through the war. So maybe that's a truer analogy to where we are now. But interestingly, Winston Churchill, good leader in a crisis, turfed out by the British public after the war because they wanted to change. They wanted a new normal, and that's where things like the NHS and the whole social welfare system in the UK was built, interestingly. So what I've tried to do is look at what's the commonality of experience across our markets. There's so much difference, partly around the lockdown timing. What is the ongoing personal risk perception? So much greater in the UK, say, than here in Australia or in New Zealand. the financial year, the ending of the financial year makes a big difference to the way we're looking at this and the way we're planning. Here in Australia, it's June. In other places, it's April or March. It actually makes a big difference to when decisions are made around budgets. What's the season? We've been lucky that in Australia and New Zealand it was summer, but in a lot of the rest of the developed world, it was winter. Did that make a difference? And what was the leadership? What was the leadership of our different countries? What I think is common, and what I've tried to do is get the trends, insights and data that looks at those commonalities. And I'm going to skip over a hell of a lot today, but that's partly because I'm going to leave you with the presentation with all of the details and all of the things I quote here so that you can look further into this. And there's some great research that I've unearthed, which looks at the common experience that we've had. One which has changed our language. It's been a common journey. So in COVID, we've created these words that have had huge prominence, and luckily, like the word pivot, disappeared just as quickly, hopefully. Like Harvey McKinnon, I think anybody who still uses the word pivot should be on a deserted island, much as that may be a benefit. We started by enthusiastically embracing the Zoom world and all had fun playing conference call bingo on Zoom. But recently, and here in Australia, we're probably 5 weeks into the lockdown, I've noticed that more and more people are turning away from Zoom and actually going back to phone conversations because they're just less stressful. In a Zoom conversation, we're looking at ourselves the whole time. We're aware we haven't done our hair, and that stresses us out whilst having a conversation, which usually if we were meeting over a coffee, we wouldn't worry about those things. So our mind is overworking all the time, which is why we're so tired. It's also turned original thinking on its head, and I liked this recently, the COVID-19 hierarchy of needs. We all sort of went into a health, liquidity and shelter and food need. Then we went into hygiene and cash flow. We all went into working from home and the challenges of that. Emerged from that, and I see this with charities that we work with, that they're coming back out of that space to be looking at the future, and that's why this is the right moment to be talking about the things we're talking about and starting to testing and being more entrepreneurial. But all of it has an impact on our mental health. It's a very stressful journey in many ways. We've also seen massive transformative impacts in the areas that we work in, and not least in social welfare, where the capabilities of market-led economies to look after their most disadvantaged have been stretched, where we on the right side of the digital divide are exploring all of these and having fun playing Zoom bingo. There are a lot of people that our organisations work with, are a lot of beneficiaries who are the other side of that digital divide and don't live in a world where they can have services delivered. Domestic abuse is going up seen articles recently in Russia, Spain, UK and Australia, well referenced, and innovative responses from organisations like Boots or pharmacies in Spain, where if you go in and ask for a particular type of bra as a woman, then that alerts them to call the domestic violence support groups, and the impact. If we're looking at where are we going, the impact actually is only just starting in developing countries. So what is going to be the impact there once it takes hold? Impacts on board behaviour. I often refer to financial control and cutting back as the toilet roll of a board member. And I think there was a lot of misinformation early in the piece about purchasing toilet roll being a panic behaviour, a completely irrational thing. In fact, it's very rational. What happens in a crisis is that we evolved to either fight or flight, which desires action. And we're looking for simple actions that we can take that give us control over our circumstances. And so therefore, if we hear that hoarding toilet roll or toilet paper is going to run out, then it's quite logical to go out and buy some. So it's not a panic in some sense, but key. When you're a board and you see financial governance as your prime responsibility, that's immediately where you go. That's immediately what you want to close down on. And what's the well-being impact generally on us as fundraisers? So I was interested the other day, LinkedIn do a workforce confidence index, and they'd done it across the Australian working population, asking how confident or whether they were more or less confident about their own well-being and future opportunities. Worryingly, if you look at the average of 12 with public administration at the top, they're at 31%, non-profits down at 5%. Part-time workers continue to feel less confident, no surprise. More than half of workers in Australia reported a decrease in personal spending, slightly up from the fortnight ago. And basically what we're seeing is huge numbers of people in the UK, as the terms used, furloughed or on JobKeeper allowances here in Australia. And so really there is a massive impact on spending power and discretionary spending, which, we have to be concerned whether this influences donations in the short and medium term. Got some data on that coming up. But key, I think interestingly here, we're seeing that non-profit workers are very, very lacking in confidence. Worryingly, I was talking to a CEO of an organisation yesterday, and they were saying they did a survey internally, a similar survey to this, which looked at how departments and individuals in departments, what their confidence was about their own well-being. And what this found was that fundraising was very much lower than the other functions within the not-for-profit. And that even more worryingly, in every single other function you looked at, if you asked somebody in projects, how are you feeling, they would say 7.5, let's say, on the scale, but their department would be at 8.5 if they assessed that. Whereas in fundraising, the opposite was true. So fundraisers are saying, what we're saying is fundraisers on this non-profit scale are even probably going to be in the worst situation. We need to bear that in mind as we move forward. If we look at the timing and where we are, I thought it was instructive the other day. I was looking at some research into what happens when you're talking, what have we got that we can draw analogies with around how we will behave once lockdown starts to be eased. And interestingly, they've done a lot of studies around basically, which started out with extended space travel and looking at people's emergence from that, or spending a long time in the Antarctic. And they identified 3 broad stages of reaction. So the first stage is heightened anxiety. Second stage of settling down to routine, marked a bit by depression. And a third stage of anticipation of change, marked by emotional outbursts, aggressiveness, and rowdy behaviour. Karen and I have been saying we've seen some of this in some of our clients over the last few days, but I think this is probably evidenced also by the behaviours outside Michigan's Senate buildings by people protesting about lockdowns in the US. Interestingly, then, if we move out and we move into the stage of coming back from the Antarctic, coming down from our space flight, or coming out of lockdown, then there's a reverse culture shock. We are worried about interacting with other people. And it's clear that in the UK, there was a survey the other day that was showing that the significant majority don't want to come out of lockdown yet, don't want to go back. And when we do, we envisage what's it going to be about? How are we going to have an office environment that actually people want to come back to? This is from a piece of work by McKinsey, looking at how you would build an office space, but also strategically. I was talking to some CEOs yesterday about exactly this issue. There's strategic issues, there's cultural issues, there's safety issues, there's people's individual preferences. And in the new normal, as we keep on talking about it, another one that is hopefully going to go soon, along with Pivot, we have a lot of people like the one CEO was talking about yesterday was saying, well, I have people who've now not had to commute for 2 hours every day for a month. Are they going to want to come back to the office 5 days a week? I doubt it. So it's very difficult to tell what will be happening and how long it will last is the conclusion from all of this, I think. In fact, a few weeks ago, earlier on, and also even the experts, I mean, when you talk about different economies, this is some data from the National Australia Group GDP forecasts. There's been impacts in Australia on commercial property. Are those companies going to want to be working more remotely, and therefore rents and office space is going to be empty, residential property is going to be impacted, international travel is going to be, every single facet of the economy in Australia and in other countries is going to be impacted. And as you can see, the experts doing their forecasts at NAB, that diagram basically says to me, well, it's a bit difficult to predict what is going to happen, but here we've had a stab, basically, and effectively their report is 6 or 7 pages of saying exactly that, going and how long it will be. At the very beginning, along with Donor Republic, we asked the question of Australian and New Zealand fundraisers, how long do you think the COVID-19 pandemic will impact fundraising? And as you can see, the majority were saying the remainder of this year or the next 2 years. And when we talked about when do you expect we'll see signs of recovery for fundraising, people were expecting to see it in the next 2 years and beyond the next 2 years. So pretty pessimistic outlook, but with a healthy 11 to 14% of people saying, I have absolutely no idea, which is probably the answer. So what are we actually seeing out there in the marketplace, and what can we learn from and interpret? And apologies, that's one slide out of a lengthy report. I'm going to carry on doing this, show you a few quick slides of data, but I will tell you where those sources are so you can go and find out more for yourself. All of them is information in the public domain. We've seen that events have not quite been totally destroyed, and we've seen green shoots of events where basically there are a whole host of new virtual events that have gone on in the UK, including spontaneous new events for the NHS. We had wonderful Captain Tom walking around his garden 100 times before his 100th birthday and raising a colossal 30 million for the NHS. Phenomenal chap. Well done, Tom. Thank you for the inspiration. And we've seen a lot of real-time events moving online, like quite successfully the RSPCA Million Paws Walk we've seen in Australia. We've seen the Cancer Council Australia's biggest morning tea, very successfully go online. And I know that Julie will talk about that in the future from her perspective. We've also heard that direct response TV has done particularly well. Why? Because advertising costs have gone down, advertising space is becoming more available, and people are more at home watching, even if they're not watching the same old TV, they're watching media. And picking up on direct response ads. So direct response TV is actually doing quite well in this period. So what we're trying to do is gather together the data and see what is really happening in real time. So in Australia and New Zealand, we've done a recent study led by Martin and Paul with a range of different partners, 6 organisations across Australia and New Zealand, looking at the data as far as we know. So we had 38 charities with $750 million worth of results to look at. And what this shows is that actually there has been a big impact in bequests and a big impact in events, although that may well be in bequests terms of gifts in wills, legacies, that actually that is a temporary thing. So we're taking those out. What we find is that excluding bequests, the income was down 14% for the month of March on the previous year. And within a year, that actually was looking good overall generally for these charities. So that decline went against the trend of the last 12 months. So we are building more data into that. If you want to be a participant in that in Australia and New Zealand, then look on LinkedIn under Martin's posts and you'll be able to enter there. What about public attitudes? NFP Synergy, a collaborator of ours in the UK who does great work looking at public attitudes, has been running a survey for the last few weeks with the British public, looking at various different aspects. And this is I find an interesting chart. So what are people's attitudes to giving? And as you'll see on these 3 waves, they've got their 24th of March in dark blue is 7th of April and pink is 28th of April. That actually more people are now saying, I think charities should continue to fundraise with the general public during the outbreak. More of the public is saying, I think charities have responded well so far to the coronavirus outbreak. And I would be willing to support a charity in different ways than previously if asked during the coronavirus outbreak. So across those 3 waves, stretching from the 20th of March to the 28th of April, we've seen consistent improves in those. At the same time as I expect my income to decrease in the next few months, has also gone down. So people are feeling a little bit more confident about their income capability, even though we know in the same time a quarter of the working population in the UK has been put on furlough. Looking at donor sentiment much more closely, there's some great work done by an organisation called About Loyalty in the UK, which many of you would know. They've been running a COVID-19 sentiment tracker. And interestingly, across the first couple of weeks, they noted that the number of people saying, number of financial supporters who said they would stop or reduce their giving went down from 30 to 17%. But interestingly, that's very different when we look at that chart by age on the left-hand side there. You'll see that older donors are much more likely to not change the charities they give to. And across the 5 weeks of study, so the second chart comes from the fifth week of the study, we see that more and more people have actually given to a COVID cause, in which case it's gone up from 9% in the 23rd of March to nearly 16% on the 20th of April. But certain causes are definitely doing better. So certain charities are benefiting more. So elderly, health, homeless and children's charities, giving has increased across that time, whereas international, environment, animal welfare and armed forces charities has actually gone down. So what we're seeing is that trust in charities is sustained during the lockdown. The proportion of people who've given to charity as a response to COVID-19 has increased to over 70%. And again, you can look at all this. And what do we know from the past? There was a great piece of work done recently by Coda Capital in Australia, bringing together international research on what we can learn from previous recessions. And this chart is from a study of the 2012 recession, really asking the question, what happened after that and previous recessions at different times, which show that actually giving returned to the levels of increase that were there before the recession in almost all of those other examples. So it actually, yes, it did decline during the recession, but then bounced back to then increasing again at a similar level to what it had done before. And commercial learnings during recessions, I think, Karen, you quoted this the other day in a session, looking at the 1974 to 1975 recession. The finding was in the commercial world that advertisers who didn't cut back their spending had higher market share, with higher sales and increased net income during and after the recession. So really, it's about being confident that we can get the returns. And what we've seen is a huge outpouring of public generosity and public goodwill in many markets, which kind of goes against what we were thinking in the first instance with the, pessimism that we probably had on day one. So that's how things have been going. And I think those are the key impacts and potentially trends and ways of measuring what we can, but it's still a very, very uncertain picture looking into the future. But key, what I take from this is that it's about keep calm and carry on fundraising. So really, those that fundraise during this period will do better. And it's often hard to do in organisations where boards and senior leadership are cost-cutting as dramatically as possible, furloughing staff as rapidly as possible. But really, we have all the evidence to say those that push on will succeed eventually. And in leadership, some things don't change. If you're looking around the world for an example of good leadership, then we can't look much further than New Zealand. Very lucky country in some ways to be so far away from the rest of the world with easily locked downable borders, but also a leader who was authentic, who was honest, who took decisive action. This I picked this book up. This is a children's book, Taking the Lead, How Jacinda Ardern Wowed the World. It's a great read. I can well recommend it if you can get a copy. But key, I think, we really should be saying when we're talking about leadership, what would Jacinda do? This image on the right-hand side is actually a Facebook session she ran with kids talking about the impact of COVID and saying that she understood how difficult it was for families, how difficult it was for kids not being able to hug granny, you know, and that, you know, we were all in this together. She didn't know when it was going to end. She didn't know when it was going to come out of it. But if we all worked together, then we would be in a much better place. Fantastic lessons for all of us as leaders. And so I think within organizations, you need to know who your confident leader is. How do you use their personality, them as a voice taking responsibility? There have been examples, good examples of this with Baptist World Aid in Australia, and John there being a good voice and strong leader in the public domain. I think as fundraisers, we have to say, when does it have to be me? When do I have to lead? When do I have to take a stand? And when was it important for me to push leadership? And importantly, what is your organizational continuity statement? So how do you make sure that you're all working in the same way to the same objective? And key, our job at this moment is to protect fundraising. You need to fight to invest, to protect fundraising and its investment as the best you can for the longer term. As Fee McPhee, great fundraising strategist working in New Zealand, who I've worked with extensively over the years, huge respect for. Effective fundraising of any kind, other than the activities you have to cancel, should be the last thing you think about cutting. Fundraising is your future, short-term and long-term. Money you don't raise now will never be recovered. So to meet the needs of our beneficiaries, which are increasing as we've talked about, your fundraising programs need to be as strong as possible. And often this is, I understand, a difficult discussion to have and a difficult argument to win with leadership that is influenced by boards and CEOs who don't understand fundraising, who are about cutting costs at all costs. So what we do to protect fundraising is to protect our base, number one. So number one action that you need to be taking, if you haven't taken it already, is protecting your base and investing in opportunities. And as one of the CEOs I was talking to said yesterday, and the others agreed, for those organizations that have reserves, this is when you use them. Reserves are there for an emergency. This is an emergency. Why do we have them if we don't use them? And investing in fundraising at this moment is the best use for those reserves. Not talking about throwing it away, but actually investing it wisely in the activities that you know will return. And it's about donor love, protecting the base. I went on to a webinar much like this with Jen Sheng from the Institute for Sustainable Philanthropy, and it reminded us that well-being is about three essential characteristics: autonomy, a sense of control. Back to my point about the toilet paper. Buy toilet paper, feel in control. Connectedness, the quantity and quality of our relationships, very difficult in lockdown, many people feeling isolated. And our competence and effectiveness as individuals. What can we do? What can we change? Can I volunteer? Can I give? We can speak to all of these things as donors. We can speak to, you know, the sense of control that we get from actually giving, the sense of enjoyment that we actually get from giving, the sense of feeling worthwhile and feeling competent in helping organizations being effectiveness. And we can connect them to a community of people like that. So that, as Jen Sheng said, the more autonomous, connected and competent people feel, the greater sense of personal well-being they will feel. Conversely, when people feel these qualities eroding, they will feel a decline in well-being. So actually talking to your donors frequently and spending your time with them now at this moment, just thanking them, telling them they're wonderful, getting feedback. That's what donors want to give us. This is the perfect opportunity to do exactly that. It's not an ask, just making them feel valued, making them feel wanted, making them feel part of your community. Also important, because if we look at Gift in Wills, a great document, The Best of Times or the Worst of Times, Legacy Fundraising in COVID by Michael Rosen and Russell James. Go back to the basics. The reasons that people focus on wills is a family structure change, a marriage, a birth, a change in that will make them reframe their will, or death becomes real, facing up to reality. At present, many are in this zone. And so what we've seen is, you know, 2 times the number of people going on to the Remember a Charity website in the UK. Many commercial will-making websites seeing their traffic increase tenfold. And so as these Michael and Russell say, for a charity being top of mind at the moment in which people are actually planning is absolutely crucial. More people are planning right now than in any normal time. So if communications can enhance a donor's sense of well-being, organisations might find that their donors will have a greater interest in supporting them with a commitment in a will or through a life insurance beneficiary designation. In other words, helping a donor feel better may ultimately benefit the charity. We'll never know how many of those great donor conversations you have right now will turn out to mean that somebody leaves you a gift in their will. But in reality, we never do know which of our conversations sparks those gifts. So it's a good time to be having them. At the end of the day, it's about doing the things we should be doing anyway. We now have the time, so we should be spending it talking to our donors. And for donors that we know are important and actually are in financial trouble, then we should be negotiating something that meets their needs in a responsive, authentic way. This is the time for authentic relationship fundraising, more so than it ever has been in the past. So stage 1 is providing leadership around fundraising individually and as an organisation and not cutting back. Stage 2, protect your base. This is what we should all be doing at this moment in time, because acquiring new donors is not necessarily so easy in the present climate. And then we need to be looking at how do we restructure our business, effectively, our fundraising. I would recommend this From Surviving to Thriving by McKinsey & Co., which came around literally in the last week, about the things that you need to do in thinking about how you come back out of this. So you need to rapidly recover your revenue through agile operations, making those things that are profitable work as hard as possible, making sure that you're running the appeals that you need to run, that you're running the campaigns that you need to run, that you're having the conversations that you need to run. And about rebuilding your operations to be more agile, to get working in a very different way, to take action as quickly as possible. And ultimately, longer term, rethink the organisation. And that starts really with asking the question who we are, how we work, and how we grow. And if you're an organisation, and when we first did our research with fundraisers in Australia and New Zealand who we asked the question, how much are you concerned about your actual organisation's survival? Then on a score of 0 to 10, I think something like 30% of people were saying they were worried to a level of 7 or 8 on that scale. So there are a lot of people who are worried about their organisations going out of business. If that is the case, then we should be collaborating and looking to collaborate in new ways. And driving innovation is what we should be doing at this moment in time. And driving in innovation through accelerating digital adoption, using all the techniques that we can for data analytics, using AI, looking at modelling, building our scenarios on different levels, and looking to the future and how we're going to return. But ultimately, McKinsey's advice is it's about putting in place a new operating model built around the consumer and supported by the right agile processes and governance. And your leadership as an organisation should be thinking about what that new normal looks like for you as an organisation. So looking broadly, how do we build back better? How do we, despite the fact that there's so much confusion out there, there's so little information which is solid at this moment in time, what can we actually do to give us some focus, going back to that well-being that can give us a sense of control and a sense of efficacy? And I would suggest that it's about planning for 6 months onwards. So really getting your head up, looking at the 6 months plus time horizon, looking at all the results against what you knew from previously, and making sure you identify the COVID-19 influence, not what was on trend to happen for you anyway. Also, there are a lot of things that are influencing. I know that I was talking to an organisation the other day about an innovation project because over 90% of their acquisition was through face-to-face, which of course, obviously they can't do now, which is projected to be difficult in projecting when its return is as well. So in reality, they desperately need innovation. And I think it's important also to look at what got switched off. What did you stop doing? Do you need to do that again? Is it something that stays switched off? Is it something that you need to switch back on? Is it an area of core profitability for you, or is it something that you should look at in a different way for the future? What have you switched on? Very important to look at what you've actually done and what has been successful. What did you do well within that? How do you model the behaviors? What was it about working? I think you will find that if you have been successful, it's because there were project teams working on things that got things done more quickly in a more agile way, with new ways of communicating that they were forced to have because of new working online. Analyze those things. Make sure you can break down what that was about. What are the models and the rules around that behavior that come out of that? And that is innovation. That is innovation right there. You've defined how your organization can be more innovative. So the question is, how do you bring those into practice day in, day out, and make them a part of your new normal as an organization? And to plan once you've taken stock. So that's all about analyzing where you are, and then it's about planning. Work on those things that you plan to do anyway. I'm talking with a couple of organizations who are looking to rebrand. You've got a perfect time to create your new brand and put it out there in the marketplace. Again, that's the plan they had in place. The organization that's 95% reliant on face-to-face should have been planning what they were going to do to replace face-to-face over time anyway and become more digital, but too much inertia in the old world. So the platform was burnt. Let's get on with it. And protect the base, so important. As in any customer-based relationship organization, keeping consumers who are with you now is easier than finding more like them. And especially in a market like ours, where building the pie is so much more difficult than increasing your slice of it. So protect your base, love the people that already love you, and innovate around the points where you really have difference, things you were going to do long term anyway, or things that you've suddenly done well that you didn't do well before. So that's how to do it in a way. Somebody spoke about it yesterday and said that, jokingly, we have the choice to come out of this lockdown period personally as a hunk, a chunk, or a drunk. Your choice. We want to come back as hunks ourselves. We want to come back as hunks as our organization. We want to do all those things that are going to make us fitter, better, and faster for the future. But overall, be kind on yourself. Be kind on yourself. We know that this is impacting us very badly. Our well-being is down. We've seen the measures on that. So be kind to yourself. I was going to read the complete works of Shakespeare during this time off. I haven't even started one. And if you haven't discovered him yet, have a look at The First Dog on the Moon. Cartoonist in The Guardian, comes from Australia and quite often talks about very Australian issues, but most of his recent ones about coronavirus have been very pertinent to everybody. And on this, have you learnt anything new in lockdown, or did you waste it? What harsh truths did you discover? So Pansy here has macrame'd a 5-meter long working model of the aircraft carrier USS Ronald Reagan. The First Dog himself has written the great Australian novel. In fact, he wrote 3 of them. Meanwhile, this lady here has tiny children. The only thing I had to learn is that every school teacher should get a raise of $11 million and live in a gold palace forever. Meanwhile, Kylie stayed alive. She did the bare minimum, frankly. That is pretty damn good under the circumstances. So well done, Kylie. And well done to all you Kylies, whatever you have done within this. Those of you that got the 5-meter long working model of the aircraft carrier Ronald Reagan, good on you. Those of you that have just survived, well done as well. I think I go back to those points if you want to be left with anything. I think that, for me, is what we should be doing now to take stock of how to return better in the future, whenever it is. And that's what I had to share for today. As I said, all of what that I've mentioned here, the references for all of those, there's a great document by McKinsey's, there's a great document on Will's, Jen Sheng's work on, philanthropy. There's references to all of that. There's references to our research and to the other donor loyalty and NFP synergy work that I have talked about. So you'll be able to go away and explore any elements of that if you want to look at it in more detail. My objective today was trying to give you a broad brush look at what I've been influenced by over the last few weeks, and I hope it's been useful for you. Thank you.
Well, that's a really incredible coverage of everything. So one of the things that I think is so helpful with this is, as you said, to get such a succinct presentation, you've had to pull from a lot of data sources. So thank you so much, Gavin. That's absolutely incredible. Now, I do have some questions, and everybody, just so you know, you are welcome to type questions, or you can speak. You can put your mics on now if there's anyone who would like to join us. Susan, I might put you on the spot too, because I know that you've had some great outcomes. So it'd be great to hear from you what you might have learned. So maybe you can either chat or see if you can get your mic going. But there is a first question for you, Gavin, which is many charities seem to want to cut costs equitably across the organisation, even though we do know that fundraising is still almost certainly profitable. So what is the argument against, equitable suffering in this case?
Very good question. And in fact, I was talking to somebody about this from a major social welfare organisation in Australia just the other day. And I think we need to look at this in business terms and talk in business terms about it, that there's a challenge that cutting a cost centre and a profit centre equally damages your business long term. I can understand why you want to reduce costs at a moment like now, but do you do that equally in somewhere that it is a cost to the business in delivering its services versus a cost to a profit centre? And fundraising is a profit centre. Use that business language and talk to people in a business way in leadership and on the board about the fact that they wouldn't do that in their own business because they know that to get out of this, they will have to be investing in those things that give them profit. And not doing that equally to those things that cost, like a cost centre. And it's a bit brutal to call them cost centres, but that's effectively what they are. I think that this is about business thinking coming onto boards of charities and not understanding fundamentally how charities and not-for-profits work. It may also be, and this is what somebody said to me the other day, their CEO comes from the cost centres, comes from the projects, and therefore he wants to, in his case, be equitable to the project's team by saying, well, I've also cut fundraising by 13%. But the implications in a business sense are that you're damaging your future. And you're also damaging your future, it's being a bit glib, in cutting your costs, but unfortunately at this moment in time, that's something you have to consider as a business that wants to survive. Is that helpful? I hope.
Really helpful. And look, and following on, I guess there's this whole question around how do we influence boards, and this specific questions around especially those loaded with financial services professionals. But what's the compelling argument to counteract their principle of donor funds for beneficiaries only, not paying fundraising salaries? So, almost weighting it more towards mission delivery.
I think, again, that is not seeing how fundraising works and understanding how fundraising works. And I think there's also a lack of understanding about exactly what is a healthy ratio. I mean, we do a lot of benchmarking work in Australia, which again is in the public domain. Happy to share all the reports that we have on that, which shows that those that underinvest get under returns. And so therefore, if you don't invest in fundraising staff and you don't invest in external costs as well, then your returns are never as good. And we've had conversations with many boards that are fixated on getting their fundraising costs down, proudly say we only spend 12, our expenditure to income ratio is 12%. And you go, well, that's not enough. It's just not enough to be effective in fundraising. And I think it is a challenge, because it is a challenge with all boards that they don't understand fundraising and they don't look at it in a business sense. And I think it does come back to the same point I just made, which is we are the profit center. The profit is, if you ran a business in the present world that delivered a profit margin of 80%, you would be about to sell it to somebody bigger and make an absolute squillion. All of us make an 80% profit every single day as fundraisers. That's a business model most business people don't understand, and particularly not people in finance industries. So yeah, it's an uphill struggle. It's a long-term battle, and unfortunately, we haven't won enough of those battles in enough organisations to not be under the pump now, because they're still applying the same business logic to the equation.
No, I think that's really good.
I don't offer a simple solution on that, because I think it's just a long-term educational program. But get all the data you can about all those organisations that are doing well, and the fact that their ratio is not 10%, it's not 15%, it's 25, 30, 40%, if they're investing and growing. And then it's all about their size, their other income, all of these things are variable. So you have to pick your data for that fight very, very carefully.
No, absolutely. And look, it's one of those things that when I first came across from Craft, and I used to talk about our profit margin was under 10%. So I actually thought people working in fundraising were a little bit mad when I first came across, looking at trying to triple the return. And look, and actually Martin's just made a quick post, but for fundraising to become unprofitable, it would need to drop by more than 62%. And we're certainly seeing no signs of that. And just to flag again, I think Gavin's pulled us together the best way of looking at the crystal ball, but also as much as possible, if people can help build up the data set and do contribute into that set of data that we're collecting, that will be incredibly valuable. And probably just one last question to finish on, Gavin, because I know that you actually do work in a lot of countries, and you tend to attend, you attend a lot of global conferences, and we've got a number of international NGOs who attend this webinar as well. What do you believe is going to be the way that organisations need to think about the impact in different countries? So how, obviously Australia's not had the same high prevalence yet, UK has had much higher. What do we need to be thinking about with those different country experiences?
I might, if I can, I think go back to the slide, probably way back at the beginning. I think that you need to understand that you're not comparing like for like. I think where the model of fundraising works in the way that is common between markets. So I would say there's a level of commonality between Western markets, Europe, so really North America, UK, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, most European countries, South Korea, countries where traditional fundraising mechanisms work, then we can believe that public motivations towards fundraising and donations are going to be fairly consistent. So then it will be about how was their economy going into this? How much damage will this do to the economy generally, the GDP? And I think factors here, lockdown timing. So when did they go into lockdown? At what point in the COVID crisis? How well have they managed that? What is their testing program? What's their whole policy around COVID? And therefore, if they're looking at easing lockdown restrictions, what is people's perception of the ongoing personal risk, and therefore how long that lockdown transition to normality, in inverted commas, is going to take? What's the season, and therefore what is the seasonal analysis of how people behave at different parts of the seasons? When are the times they give, and when are those times coming up compared to when they're going to come out of lockdown? I mean, in Australia, we have the challenge that all of us are in the process of launching, end of financial year campaigns right now, at the moment where uncertainty is the greatest. And if we're asking people where they think they're going to be financially in 2 months, that's not a conversation they want to have. So very difficult to predict what's going to happen in Australia with our major repeal of the year, which in philanthropic terms dwarfs December for major gifts. So, that will change in every country. Where there's tax deductibility in Australia, it has that mechanism. Where you don't have tax deductibility, the end of the financial year is March, April. In the UK, it's a very different picture. And, in reality, what's their leadership saying about lockdown? What are the government allocations to not-for-profits? How has that influenced the way that not-for-profits see their funding? So I think there's no one-size-fits-all in all of this. But I think looking at all of those different factors that I just mentioned there, it's a huge list. But I think then says there'll be a slightly different model for each different country. But the basic underpinnings of why fundraising works and why donors engage and why the way that the public see charities, may not be that different. But I think all of those other economic, political, and COVID-19 factors will change the diagram for each country that we come out with at the end of the day once you've looked at all of that data.
No, that's really helpful. And look, thank you again, Gavin. I just, as I said, I think we could probably run for a couple of hours with all of this information that we've done. But look, I do want to do one quick shout out, which is, there's some real optimism. There's some silver lining around all of this. So the May 50K, which is for MS Research Australia, is looking like it will double its income from last year. So 2 million raised last year and looking very much like 4 million will be achieved. So always nice to have a little positive celebration at the end. So thanks for sharing that.